Welcome back to the deep dive. When you sent in these research excerpts on social constructs and evolutionary behavior, I have to admit I was a little skeptical.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it seemed like one of those dense academic topics that could go either way, fascinating or falsely boring.
Yeah,
But as I started reading, well, let's just say my brain is buzzing with questions.
I get that. Yeah, it's one of those areas where the more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know. It really challenges some basic assumptions about what makes us tick.
Exactly. And it's got me looking at everyday things in a whole new light. So let's break this down for our listeners. We're essentially diving into this idea that the ways humans organize ourselves, our societies, our hierarchies, even our ideas about gender roles, might be influenced by millions of years of evolution.
Right. It's not just a blank slate that we get to write on with culture. Our biology, shaped by evolution, seems to play a role in how we construct our social world.
So let's start with that evolutionary foundation, as the research calls it. I mean, we hear all the time about how our brains evolved for survival, but is it really that simple?
Not quite. You see, one of the leading theories in this field is the social brain hypothesis. It suggests that the reason we humans have these unusually large, complex brains isn't just for, figuring out how to use tools or find food.
Right.
It's because our ancestors lived in complex social groups, and navigating those groups required serious mental horsepower.
Okay, that's starting to make sense. So it's like our brains had to evolve to keep up with all the drama of primate social life.
Exactly. Think about it. To survive and thrive in those groups, our ancestors had to form alliances, understand hierarchies, predict other individuals' behavior, and even manipulate social situations to their advantage. Those are mentally demanding tasks.
So fast forward to today, and we still have that same brain hardware, but now we're trying to apply it to modern society, which is obviously a whole different ballgame.
That's the fascinating part. The research argues that many of our social structures, even those that seem purely cultural, actually have roots in this evolutionary past.
Like, give me an example, something concrete.
Well, let's take something as universal as status hierarchies. We see them everywhere, from corporate offices to schoolyards to, yes, even those seemingly peaceful chimpanzee communities.
Okay, yeah, hierarchies are definitely everywhere. But I always thought that was just a human thing, a product of culture and power structures.
It's more complicated than that. There's actually research on dominance hierarchies among chimps, which are remarkably similar to human ones, even though they don't have our complex societies. And this suggests that there might be a deeper biological basis for our tendency to organize ourselves in these hierarchical structures.
So it's not just that we're copying what we see around us. There might be something ingrained in our biology that predisposes us to create these
Yeah,
hierarchies.
right. And it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. Hierarchies, for all their flaws, provide a form of social order. They can facilitate cooperation, reduce conflict, and even enhance group survival in certain circumstances.
So it's not just about individuals vying for power. It's about something deeper, a need for social organization that might be woven into our very DNA.
That's a great way to put it. And this brings us to another key point the research makes, that it's not just a one-way street from evolution to social structures.
Wait, what do you mean?
Well, there's this concept of a feedback loop between biological evolution and social construction.
Okay, that sounds a bit complicated. Can you unpack that a bit more?
Imagine a dance where the music, which represents our biology, influences the steps we take, which are like our social structures. But the way we dance, representing our cultural practices, also starts to change the rhythm of the music over time. That's the feedback loop.
I'm starting to see it. So the social structures we create actually feed back into the evolutionary process. How does that work?
It's all about selective pressures. The social constructs we live in can actually influence which traits get passed down to future generations.
Hold on. So you're telling me that the way we organize our societies can actually influence how we evolve biologically. That's kind of mind-blowing.
It is. For example, if a society values cooperation and altruism, those traits might be more likely to be favored over time because they lead to greater success within that social structure. It's this incredible dance between nature and nurture constantly influencing each other over time.
Okay, I'm definitely getting the buzzing with questions
Yeah.
feeling now.
Yeah.
This is a lot to process. So it's not a question of either nature or nurture. It's this dynamic interplay between our biology and our culture.
Exactly. And the research argues that our very capacity to create these social structures, this complex dance we're talking about, is itself a product of evolution.
So it's like evolution gave us the tools to create these structures, and then the structures themselves started shaping our evolution.
Precisely. And here's where it gets even wilder. Cultural evolution. The changes in beliefs and behaviors within a society operates much faster than biological evolution. Think of it as a rapid adaptation mechanism.
Okay, that makes sense.
Right.
So we can adapt to new environments and challenges much quicker through cultural changes than we could if we had to wait for our genes to catch up.
Exactly. And that's a key takeaway here. We're not just passive recipients of our evolutionary heritage. We have the capacity to shape our own social constructs, even if they have roots in our biology.
So it's not about being trapped by our past.
Yeah.
It's about understanding those influences and then using that knowledge to make conscious choices
Hmm.
about the kind of world we want to create.
You got it. And that's where the research starts to get really interesting, looking at the implications of all this for how we live our lives today. But I think we need to pause here and dive into that in part two.
Definitely. It's getting too good to rush.
Yeah, I know, right?
We'll be right back with more. All right, so we've laid some groundwork. We've got this idea that our evolutionary past might be influencing our social structures in ways we don't even realize. But I have to admit, this whole feedback loop concept has me a little perplexed. How does this actually play out in the real world?
It's like ripples on a pond.
Right.
Our biology sets the initial conditions, but then our social structures create these waves that interact and change the landscape over time.
Okay, I like that analogy. But can you give me a concrete example?
Let's go back to status hierarchies. The research points to a fascinating study where researchers observed preschoolers barely old enough to tie their own shoes already exhibiting subtle status cues.
Wait, really? Like what kind of cues?
Things like subtle body language, taking up more space, even the way they spoke to each other. It was all very nuanced, but it was there. And this suggests that even in environments designed to be egalitarian, this tendency to form hierarchies emerges incredibly early.
That is wild.
Mm.
So it's not just something we learn from adults. It's almost like it's pre-programmed into us.
And that's the point the research is driving at. These seemingly innate tendencies shaped by evolution can interact with our cultural norms in fascinating ways.
Okay, I'm starting to wrap my head around this. But I have to ask, if our evolutionary heritage predisposes us to certain behaviors, does that mean we're stuck with them? What about social structures that seem harmful or unjust? Are we saying those are just natural and therefore inevitable?
That's a crucial question, and thankfully the research doesn't fall into that deterministic trap. It acknowledges that while our evolutionary past might create certain predispositions, it doesn't dictate our destiny. We have the power to shape our social world, even if it means swimming against the evolutionary tide.
Right. Okay, that's a relief. But if we're constantly being pulled in these different directions by our biology on the one hand and our cultural values on the other, how do we navigate that tension?
That's where the concept of cultural evolution comes in. Think of it as our secret weapon. It allows us to adapt and change at a much faster pace than biological evolution ever could. We can consciously choose to modify or even dismantle social constructs that are no longer serving us well.
So it's like we have this amazing ability to override our programming, so to speak, to rewrite the code.
In a sense, yes. We can look at those ingrained tendencies, understand where they come from, and then decide whether we want to reinforce them or challenge them.
That's incredibly empowering.
Yeah.
But it also sounds incredibly daunting. Where do we even begin?
Well, the research highlights a few key areas where this understanding can be applied. For example, public policy.
Interesting. So how does evolutionary thinking change the way we approach policymaking?
It encourages us to think about the unintended consequences of policies. If we try to design policies that go directly against our deeply ingrained tendencies, we're likely to encounter resistance even if our intentions are good.
Can you give me an example?
Sure, let's say we're talking about policies aimed at promoting parental leave for both mothers and fathers. On the surface, it seems like a great idea promoting gender equality and all, but if we ignore the fact that women biologically are the ones who give birth and often have a stronger initial bond with the infant, we might design a policy that, while well-intentioned, doesn't actually achieve its goals.
So it's not just about creating a policy that sounds good on paper.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the deep-seated behavioral patterns that might influence how people actually respond to it.
Exactly. And it's not about saying we can't or shouldn't challenge those patterns. It's about being strategic and realistic in how we go about it.
That makes a lot of sense. So instead of trying to force a square peg into a round hole, we need to work with the grain of human nature, so to speak.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And this applies to so many areas beyond policy. The research also delves into education.
Oh, that's interesting. So how does this evolutionary lens change the way we think about teaching and learning?
Well, traditional education often emphasizes rote memorization and passive learning. But our brains didn't evolve for that. They evolved for active learning through experience, problem solving, and social interaction.
So sitting in rows, listening to lectures, and taking standardized tests might not be the most effective way to tap into our innate learning abilities.
That's what the research suggests. It advocates for creating learning environments that are more engaging, hands-on, and tailored to the way our brains are wired.
So more project-based learning, more collaboration, more real-world applications.
Exactly. And it also highlights the importance of social learning, learning from and with others. We are, after all, social creatures at our core.
Okay, I'm seeing how this applies to education. What about something like mental health?
It offers a fascinating perspective there, too. Many mental health issues can be seen as maladaptive responses to modern stressors. Our brains, wired for survival in a very different environment, are now struggling to cope with the constant stimulation and pressure of modern life.
So it's like our ancient hardware is trying to run modern software, and it's causing all sorts of glitches.
That's a great analogy. For example, our fight or flight response, which was essential for dealing with immediate threats in the past, can get stuck in overdrive in today's world, leading to chronic anxiety and stress.
Okay, I see the connection there. So how does understanding the evolutionary roots of these issues help us treat them?
It helps us develop more targeted and effective therapies. Instead of just treating the symptoms, we can address the underlying mechanisms working with our evolutionary heritage rather than against it.
So it's about rewiring those ancient circuits to function better in the modern world.
Exactly. And the implications extend even further into areas like organizational behavior.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does this evolutionary perspective change the way we think about workplaces and organizations?
It can help us design more effective team structures, leadership styles, and even conflict resolution strategies. For example, understanding our innate tendency to form hierarchies can help us create organizational structures that, while acknowledging that tendency, also promote collaboration and prevent abuses of power.
So it's about creating a more conscious and intentional work environment, one that's aligned with both our evolutionary heritage and our modern aspirations.
You got it. And this is just scratching the surface. This research has the potential to inform so many aspects of our lives, from how we design cities to how we approach criminal justice reform.
Wow, the more we talk about this, the more I realize just how far-reaching these ideas are. It's like we're holding up a mirror to ourselves, seeing our species in a whole new light.
And the reflection is both fascinating and challenging. It forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves, but it also offers a path toward creating a more just and fulfilling future.
I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored how this feedback loop plays out in real-world scenarios and started to unpack the implications for everything from public policy to mental health to the very structures of our organizations.
And there's still so much more to explore, but I think we need to shift gears slightly for our final segment.
You're right. We've explored the what and the how, but now it's time to delve into the so what's. What does all this mean for our listeners sitting here absorbing all this information? What can they do with it? Okay, so we've gone deep into the research you sent us. It's clear that evolution has shaped our social instincts and even the structures of our societies in profound ways. And we've even got this feedback loop where the societies we build then influence our evolution. But I think the question on our listeners' mind right now is, so what? What do I do with this information?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. It's tempting to just think, well, that's just human nature and leave it at that. But the whole point of this deep dive is to show that we're not just passive passengers on this evolutionary train. We have agency.
I like that agency. We're not just robots acting out our programming, but it can feel overwhelming. Like, where do you even start to apply this knowledge? It's not like we can single-handedly rewire our brains or redesign society overnight.
Absolutely. And the research doesn't offer some simple five-step plan, but it does provide a framework for thinking about change. One key takeaway for me is the importance of conscious awareness. The more we understand these hidden influences, the more we can make deliberate choices both individually and collectively.
Okay, so awareness is step one, but then what?
Well, think of it like this. Imagine you're trying to navigate a city you've never been to before. You could just wander around randomly, but you'd probably get lost or end up somewhere you didn't want to be. But if you have a map, even a rough one, you can start to make informed decisions about which direction to go in.
So this research is like a map of our social landscape. It helps us understand the terrain so we can choose our path more intentionally.
Exactly. And that map helps us see not just where we are, but also where we might want to go. It allows us to imagine alternative routes, different ways of organizing ourselves and interacting with each other.
So it's not just about understanding the past, it's about using that understanding to create a better future.
Right. And that's where the concept of cultural evolution comes back into play. We have this incredible capacity to change our societies, our values, and even our behaviors much faster than biological evolution could ever allow.
Okay, so we have the power to change, but change is hard. We see that all the time, right? Societies can be incredibly resistant to even the most sensible reforms.
Of course. And the research acknowledges that it doesn't offer any easy answers, but it does suggest that by understanding our evolutionary baggage, so to speak, we can be more effective in our efforts to create change. We can anticipate the resistance, address those underlying fears and anxieties, and design solutions that are more aligned with our natural inclinations.
So it's not about ignoring our evolutionary past or
Yeah.
pretending it doesn't exist. It's about understanding it and working with it rather than against it.
You got it. And one of the most powerful ways to do that is through education. The more people understand these concepts, the more we can create a collective movement for positive change.
I love that. It's not about top-down control or imposing some grand vision. It's about empowering individuals to make informed choices and to become agents of change in their own lives and communities.
Exactly. And those individual actions, however small they may seem, can collectively create a ripple effect that transforms the entire social landscape.
So what would you say to our listener who's sitting here thinking, this is all fascinating, but I'm just one person. What difference can I make?
I'd say never underestimate the power of one. It starts with those small everyday choices.
Yeah.
How you interact with others, the assumptions you challenge, the values you embody. It's about becoming more mindful of the social structures you participate in and asking yourself, do these structures serve us well? Are they aligned with the kind of world I want to live in?
So it's about asking those tough questions, even in seemingly mundane situations.
Exactly. And it's about being willing to challenge the status quo, even if it makes people uncomfortable. Sometimes the most powerful act of change is simply refusing to go along with something that feels wrong.
I love that. It's about having the courage to say, hey, wait a minute. Maybe there's a better way to do this.
Precisely. And it's about having those difficult conversations, even with people who hold different views. It's about listening with empathy,
Mm.
seeking common ground, and being willing to find solutions that work for everyone.
So it's not about preaching or lecturing. It's about engaging in respectful dialogue and trying to understand where other people are coming from, even if we disagree with them.
You nailed it. And remember, social change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, persistence, and a willingness to keep pushing forward, even when it feels like you're not making a
This
difference.
is about playing the long game, staying committed to those values, and never giving up hope that a better world is possible.
Exactly. And I think that's the most important message we can leave our listener with today. You are not powerless. You have the ability to make a difference, however small it may seem. And by working together with understanding and compassion, we can create a future that is truly worthy of our humanity.
Wow. That's a beautiful and inspiring way to wrap up this deep dive. We've explored some complex and challenging ideas today, but I think the takeaway is ultimately one of hope and empowerment.
Totally. And it's like we always say on this show, knowledge is power.
It really is. So until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving to make a positive difference in the world.
Thanks for listening.